second, and we just get started. So this is Kinesthetic Earworms and the Epistemology of Chinese Mind-Body Practice. Pardon me as I figure out how to get this going. So there we go. So I'm interested in ritualized contemplative mind-body practices. And this is part of a book project that I'm currently in the middle of. I examine a bunch of different practices. Many of the practices I examine are what are called Qigong. Qigong is basically Chinese-style yoga-like exercises. And there's different names people use for them. Sometimes people call them Yang Sheng. Some people call them Dalian. I tend to use the word Qigong because that's what most of my teachers have referred to them as, but there are a variety of names. Sometimes people distinguish one from the other of those things, but I'm using this as a broad umbrella term. There's lots and lots of different kinds of Qigong practice. They can range from very soft and gentle to quite vigorous. They can range from traditional and quote unquote authentic, at least purporting to have roots that go way back into one part or another of Chinese tradition, to practices that are obviously quite new agey, to some that are secularized in one way or another. One example of a practice we're going to talk about in what follows is a practice called silk reeling, or sometimes called silk coiling or Qian Gong. We'll get to that. But I talk about lots and lots of different kinds in the overall project. I'm also interested in Asian martial arts, especially so-called internal Chinese martial arts. And one example we're going to talk about in what follows is Tai Chi Chuan, or Tai Chi. People call Tai Chi or Tai Chi. And then I'm also interested in assorted meditation techniques. And sometimes these fall under the umbrella of Qigong. Sometimes people think of them as separate. I'm interested in things like mindfulness meditation or Buddhist Vipassana meditation. Even though I'm not going to talk about it directly in what follows, we might in the follow-up. I'm interested in practices called standing meditation, or in Chinese, Jianzhuang. And then we're going to talk about a particular meditation, what follows, called Microcosmic orbit meditation, or small heavenly orbit meditation. And we'll talk about that in what follows. And then more broadly, I'm also interested in things like Indian-style Hatha yoga, but today it's mostly Qigong and meditation. So the big picture, I argue in what follows, but also in the bigger project this is from, that at least some of these mind-body practices can amount to ways of thinking about and understanding the world. And I argue that they can constitute ways of doing philosophy with and through the body, rather than with and through words and word-like thoughts. But as with everything interesting, the devil, as always, is in the details. So some preliminaries about my approach and my motivations here. This is both for the bigger project, but also just to kind of contextualize what comes next. So just to start with, the mind-body practices I consider do not seem, on the surface and from the outside, to be interestingly epistemic or cognitive. The moving practices typically consist in waving the arms and moving the body in various ways. The meditative practice we're going to consider today involves something like visualizing energy or light or qi circling around inside the body. These practices often can be fun to do. Sometimes they're kind of miserable and tedious or like hard on the body, but they can be really fun. They can contribute to all kinds of wellness, but nothing about them makes them seem like promising ways of thinking or coming to know, or at least that's my initial reaction to them. I think it's a lot of people's reaction to them. I mean, you can come to know something about Chinese tradition. You can come to know something about your own reaction to these practices, but they don't seem like particularly promising epistemic pathways in general. However, both traditional texts about these practices and contemporary practitioners often claim that the practices can bring about some kind of transformative insight. And part of my motivation is to try, in a sympathetic yet critical way, to make some sense of that claim. Now, there are three broad aspects of these mind-body practices that I think, both separately and in combination, are cognitive or epistemic in ways that aren't at first obvious. So these are the bodily shapes, the visualizations, and then the wild stories that go along with them. So to say some more about that, these practices involve bodily movements and sometimes static bodily postures that go on in the practices. They often will involve, or sometimes they'll completely consist in, visualizations and directed imaginings in other sense modalities that constitute or supplement many of the practices. And there's often wild stories. These are background mythic narratives, sometimes origin stories sometimes other kinds of accompanying mythic stories, as well as metaphysical or cosmological theories that accompany both the teacher-to-student transmission of and the ongoing performance of these practices. And these are things typically like Chinese traditional five-phase or five-element correlative metaphysics or yin-yang theory, but there's other visions of the body and theories about the body that are in the background sometimes too. We're mainly going to talk about 1 and 2 and what follows, but maybe the wild stories will come up later. So some more preliminaries. The suggestion that these practices are epistemic or cognitive might seem just immediately to beg for an analysis along the lines of an activism or some kind of 4E that's embodied, embedded, and active extended cognition approach. Or maybe kind of from a different angle, a Richard Schusterman style somasthetics approach. Or maybe a cognitive linguistics conceptual metaphor theory approach to embodiment of the kind done by Lakoff and Johnson, obviously, but in Chinese philosophy, Ted Slingerland and Sarah Matthijs have really interesting books that have engaged with this directly. And then Shay Welch, I don't know if she's been able to join us yet or not, but she's coming. She in Native American performance studies uses that kind of framework as part of her approach. And I'm sympathetic with all these approaches, but for reasons that I'm not going to talk about right now, I'm going to try to begin here to develop an account that doesn't rely, or at least doesn't rely heavily, on the technical vocabulary and theoretical moves of those approaches. Much of what I will be doing when follows is a kind of phenomenology. I'm going to try to do in part, and there's a lot of words on the screen, but I'm going to just talk to them as quickly as I can, the ones that matter for us. I'm going to do something like what dance theorists like Maxine Sheets Johnstone, Kimmerer, Lamoth, Michelle Merritt, and lots of others try to do for dance, what Shay Welch does for Native American dance or performance. There's a performance theorist named Ben Spatz who does really interesting work on performance. Jesus Ilindena Garuza does like stuff on sports and martial arts, a variety of other stuff, people in philosophy and martial arts. James Garrison has a brand new book I haven't had a chance to look at that engages with this, with Confucian practices. But my angle of attack, as it were, is going to be different from any of those scholars just listed. Last preliminary, I think. In the overall project, I'm interested in treating all these practices as a kind of Pierre Hadot style philosophy of life, albeit one that's done more through and with the body than is sometimes discussed under the philosophy of life heading. But there are others who are doing work on contemplative practices like this, and specifically using philosophy of life heading. So Louis Comyathi, a religious studies scholar, uses that heading for contemplative practices in general. And our own Bin Song is doing really interesting work using philosophy of life heading for Chinese and especially Ruist or Confucian ritual practices. Okay, let's listen if this works to some. There we go. Bin Song, you got it. I can, yeah, okay, I think it's better now. Okay, so I'm interested in musical earworms, like a song stuck in one's head or a song stuck in one's mind. And in the full paper at this stage, I give a first personal account of having that song Respect stuck in my mind. But I'll begin to just give you a little bit of it. So like, here's at least the beginning of an account, right? Over and over, it's like snippets of the song are playing. And I hear her spelling out R-E-S-P-E-C-T and then singing, you know what it means to me. And then a moment later, it's as if I hear bits and pieces of the backup singers going, sock it to me, sock it to me. And then the saxophones, or maybe it's the saxophones plural, and odds and ends of all the rest. There are places where I do not know the exact words or how the instrumental parts of the music go, but even there, something gets filled out. So I've got a musical earworm. And to begin to characterize a little bit more, it's that thing that happens when you listen to a song and then with no real effort, find yourself remembering a particularly catchy part of it again and again. I'm having a bit of involuntary musical imagery using language of a certain strand of recent empirical research on this stuff, in which I experience the involuntary imagining of repeated fragments of music. Now, what exactly is it for someone to have an earworm? So as a first approach, is to find oneself involuntarily, or as I will argue, semi-voluntarily, remembering parts of a song in such a way that it is as if the song were being performed when it is not. It is, at least in part, the having of what we might call an auditory image of some kind, or perhaps a series of auditory images, or maybe experiencing auditory imagery. And it is for it to be as if you could hear a song being sung or played, although the experience in most cases is not exactly like hearing a song being sung or played. Now, there's at least as I reflect on my own experience about this, and that's a key part of the methodology here, but in people I talk to, I don't think it's all that unique, although I'm not sure it matters much how unique it is. But the question, who is singing or performing in the earworm? Sometimes the experience of having an earworm is as if somebody else were singing or playing the music. So like when I had that Aretha Franklin Respect earworm, it's like I hear Aretha Franklin singing. Right? But at other times, I think it's very specifically as if you yourself were singing, humming, or playing the music. Right? So sometimes when I have this, like, oh, I'm the one doing it. Or maybe it's me in an alternative possible world where like somehow I'm Aretha Franklin at somehow like Kripke issues be damned, right? Sometimes I think it's kind of blurry, whether it is as if you were the one singing it, or in the case of an instrumental song without lyrics, as if you were the one playing it, or whether it's as if you were the audience to someone else doing it, or even as if you were listening to a recording of the song being played on speakers or headphones. I think actually what often happens, at least with me, is it kind of goes back and forth, or it's something in between. Perhaps in some cases, at least, the earworm experience goes back and forth between it being as if you were the maker of the music, or as if you were or the only member of the audience for a performance of the music. Or perhaps we should say the experience of having the earworm, always or sometimes, is better described as being something distinct and somehow in between those two kinds of cases. Now, importantly, I think there are behavioral and bodily manifestations, and like having an earworm often involves distinctive and obvious behavioral bodily manifestations or symptoms like humming or singing along, other movements like playing air guitar, or like putting your head back as you imagine belting it out in front of an audience, or at least that's what happens with me sometimes. But regardless of whether or not the earworm causes the behavior or bodily manifestations, or is somehow either in whole or in part constituted by such dispositions to exhibit bodily behaviors or manifestations, it's clear that earworm phenomena often involve them somehow. They often involve urges, and maybe they need to involve urges, I think. So these might be urges to sing or hum out loud, or otherwise to move the body, in which case they blur into dispositions to behave of the sort just mentioned. But the urges might also be urges merely to want to keep singing or humming the song to oneself, on the inside, as it were. Such urges to sing or hum to oneself on the inside are presumably like urges to keep remembering, or otherwise to keep running the auditory imagery. Now, just nota bene, and it might be obvious already, but I just want to kind of make it clear. In describing these experiences, I want to be as neutral as possible with regard to various competing accounts of the metaphysics of mind. They might get forced on me or on us at some point, but I want to try to be neutral for reasons that I can talk about later. There's going to be, I think, visual imagery too. So like they're often described as involuntary auditory images, but I think there's often visual images. So you might have snippets of visual imagery of a vocalist singing, or a quartet of jazz musicians playing the song. They might be images of someone else creating the music, or if it's as if you yourself are singing it, it's images of yourself creating the music as you really are, or in some imaginary alternative world. There might also be images of like printed words of the lyrics, or like, for example, when I have the respect earworm, I sometimes like see flashes of RESPECT, right? I don't know if I saw that in a video somewhere or not, but maybe even like images of notes printed on a scale, or things like a crowd of people at a concert, or sitting around a campfire listening to a song, like the old, I remember being taught as a kid, the old Kumbaya, my Lord, Kumbaya song, and singing around a campfire, right? And you might have visual images of that, or of people dancing, or especially if you've seen like a music video, images like that. To push a little bit further, I think there's also going to often be imagery in whatever, in any sense modality whatsoever. So like if you hear a song at a spin class or at the gym and it sticks with you and you get the earworm, You might have visual, auditory, or even olfactory images of the sights, sounds, and smells of the gym or the spin class. Or suppose you play a song like at a romantic dinner, and then afterward, later in the evening, you like have the earworm a little bit, right? There might be gustatory images of the taste of the dinner where one's played the song in the background, or images of whatever the remembered or imagined sense experiences are or were that did or might have accompanied the experience of listening to or creating the music that's stuck in one's head. Content of the song also comes in. So musical earworm imagery often tracks the content, both cognitive and emotional, of the music that's imagined. Sometimes that content that shapes the imagery of the earworm is content from within the song itself, i.e., it tracks the story that's conveyed in the words of the lyrics. But sometimes the imagery, I think, tracks what we might think of as external things that one knows about the song, but which are not in any significant way part of the song itself. So like, if you know that the White Stripes song, Seven Nation Army, is often played at big sporting events, like if you then have that song, which is often a catchy one, if I ever think about it, like I get that song going through my head a little bit, I'll have images of like a sports stadium after I learned it, like, oh, hey, that's often used at sporting events to rile up the crowd. There's relationships more broadly of earworms to thinking, or of thinking to earworms. So like on the one hand, I think the content of an earworm can precipitate or cause thinking about that content, right? So the content of a musical earworm can cause, or at least somehow precipitate, one thinking about such and such subject matter related to the content. One thing that sort of strikes me, the more I've reflected on this, is that thinking about something can precipitate an earworm with that content. So I think experiences, memories, or thoughts that are contentful in such and such ways can cause or precipitate one having specific earworms that are related to those contents. So just a little personal example. A few years back, there was a really awful case in my neighborhood. There was a serial killer who was shooting people over a period of about 6 weeks, I think. And I wasn't thinking about it all the time, but it was quite stressful. And I would notice at various points, I was having going through my head, bum, 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 psycho killer, run, run away, right? Something that was actually more close to the Talking Heads song in my head when I experienced it. But I would think like, why am I singing this song? I hadn't heard it for a long time. And as best I could piece together, right, I was thinking about a damn psycho killer in the neighborhood. And like, I wasn't, like, it was a little bit later, I would have this song going through my head. Now, other cases like that I've begun to notice, and this might be idiosyncratic, but I suspect it's not so much. So one thing to note, you might be asking, well, look, where do you draw the line? And for my purposes here and what follows, it doesn't matter where exactly we draw the line between what is actually part of the earworm itself and what is something that merely tends to go along with earworms. There's places where we might really want to be careful about that. But like, if you want to say, what I mean by the earworm or the song stuck in your head is just the auditory imagery, that's cool. But then just recognize, right, there's all these other images that often accompany it. I'm not sure anything really much matters for what I'm going to do with it below. A few more things about earworms, and then we're going to shift gears. So I think it's important to note that these things are semi-voluntary in a lot of cases, not involuntary. So even though there's something obviously involuntary about many earworm experiences, people complained about having baby sharks stuck in their head or something, right? And people sometimes really quite suffer with these. They're not in general completely involuntary. They can be destroyed. You can often force an earworm to go away by directing your attention elsewhere or starting up another song. Or you can create them. You can usually, or sometimes, get them relatively easily started by listening to a particular tune, by beginning to hum it to oneself, or even by simply imagining it out of the blue. Okay, so now we're going to switch. Let's talk about something different. Well, slightly different. So there's a practice called silk reeling, and there's yours truly doing one of many versions of it, and just not doing it really all that beautifully, but it gives you the impression. So silk reeling or silk coiling, depending on how one translates the Chinese expression chansi, is a training practice associated with Chen style Tai Chi Chuan or Tai Chi. I understand they also use it in Wu style, and you can find aspects of this in other styles of Tai Chi. But I know it from Chen style, different kinds of Chen style. So it involves moving the arms and rotating and shifting various parts of the body in coordinated ways to produce specific kinds of more or less circular patterns of movement. One makes various curvilinear movements with one's arms while shifting one's weight, or at least rotating one's hip joints. Some versions that I've learned, you don't shift the weight very much, but it's all in the hips. But they go back and forth, and you do this while simultaneously moving other parts of the body, all the while trying to avoid any herky-jerky, starting and stopping or speeding up and slowing down. One moves as if one were trying to pull a long thread of silk out of a silkworm cocoon. Pardon me, yeah. So I'm gonna start this video. We don't want the sound. So silk reeling practice can teach how to respond to incoming violent physical force in the form of someone trying to push you off your feet and shove you to the ground. And here we have a teacher of what's called Chen practical method, Taiji Chuan, Master Chen Zhonghua. I'm not his student, but I've studied with one of his disciples for about 5 years previously and was able to go to a workshop with him. He's demonstrating here parts of how you would use some of the practices that I did a version of a moment ago in a physical confrontation. But there really are multiple applications, multiple martial applications of even the relatively simple silk reeling practice I just showed before, and there's lots of other silk reeling practices that look a little bit different, but typically use curvilinear movement of a certain sort. Here in this video, as I talk, you'll see this is one of Chen Zhonghua's main teachers, Master Feng Zhichang, who passed away in 2012. It's about a year before he died, I guess. He's the guy in the black, guy who just turned around right there, who's doing things like silk reeling-like moves. It's kind of hard to see when he does it, in like practicing what's called push hands practice of a certain sort. So there's a transformative potential in these. The practice of silk reeling can build strength, stamina, coordination, in some cases, flexibility. It can be calming and relaxing. You can do it as a kind of relaxation exercise. It can build character or virtues, right? It's kind of brutal on the legs, at least at first. So it builds things like patience, determination. It obviously, in certain contexts, can develop martial skills. And I'm going to suggest later, it and other things can develop more general, not just knowing how, but also knowing that. And I wish we could just kind of watch him more, but we're going to move on to the next screen. So now I want to talk about a different practice. This is a meditation practice called microcosmic orbit meditation. So we've got this circling practice of silk reeling in various forms. And then there's a different practice called microcosmic orbit meditation, sometimes translated more literally as small heavenly orbit meditation, or in Chinese, it's Xiaozhou Tian. And it's a meditation practice that involves repeatedly moving qi or energy from the region around one's perineum, up along the back of the body, over the top of the head, and back down the front of the body toward the perineum again. And I think you can see my cursor here. I'm not sure if you're seeing my cursor, but the little image on the left here, right? There's the torso. It can begin anywhere really, but let's say it begins at the perineum, what's called the meeting point of yin, acupuncture point, the hui yin. And you imagine or move energy up the back, up this red yang channel called the dumai, or the governor channel. And it can be either outside the body or just inside the body. You imagine going down the front, to the upper palate, the tongue goes up to drop it down the front line of the body, or you're imagining it dropping down the front line of the body, and it keeps circling. And over here on the right, this is a photo I took from the Baiyunguan White Cloud Temple in Beijing a bunch of years ago this is a stylized representation of the same thing that we're seeing on the other side, although the person's head on the gray image here is facing left. It's a kind of landscape image of the body and vision of the body that's in the background here. So microcosmic orbit, sorry, I went back the wrong way, is a practice that is a traditional Taoist practice. It gets taught in lots of contexts now. It can be a really cool practice, and you can do it while, one of the ways I was taught to do it is you can breathe in as you imagine energy going up your back, breathe out as it goes down the front. And so you can begin to coordinate kinesthetic sensations of the breath with the movement or the imagined movement of qi in the body. It's also taught by a teacher tapping various acupuncture points up the back and on the top of the head. And people sometimes will say they experience having their orbit suddenly opened by that. It's a practice that comes in lots of forms. Sorry, I'm going the wrong way here. Yeah, okay, sorry. Silk reeling and microcosmic orbit, just a point of note, they're practices that can be combined and done simultaneously by a practitioner. This is me doing another version. This is a practice called, by my teacher, grasping the chi. It's just another kind of silk rolling practice. Sometimes that might be intentional, that somebody does the movements while purposely bringing or imagining chi moving up the back of the body as the arms go up and down the front as the arms go down. Sometimes people report it spontaneously happening without consciously intending it. So, okay, now here's what I want to do with this. We've set up like musical earworms, given you all the preliminaries, introduced very briefly these two practices. So now I want to think about the possibility of kinesthetic earworms. So here's my suggestion of how at least one kind of qigong and meditation practice, or one sort of that, can function as a way of thinking or understanding. It creates something like an earworm, except one based in sensations of movement rather than auditory sensations. So in other words, it gives rise to what we might somewhat awkwardly, but nevertheless, hopefully memorably, refer to as a kinesthetic earworm. So think of a kinesthetic earworm as having a kinesthetic image or series of kinesthetic images, like images associated with movement at its core, in much the same way that a musical earworm has an auditory image or series of auditory images at its core. The idea of a kinesthetic earworm is, at least in part, that of a semi-voluntary kinesthetic image or series of kinesthetic images that's analogous to what goes on in terms of auditory imagery in the case of a musical song being stuck in one's head or in one's mind. There will be a host of other kinds of images, bodily manifestations, urges, and at least potentially assorted accompanying thoughts that in some way are included in or connected to the kinesthetic earworm, in much the same way that there were all those things, the different images, bodily manifestations, urges, and thoughts that are connected to musical earworms beyond the auditory images of the music itself. So in the full paper, a lot of the work is done by like hopefully helpful, but detailed phenomenological descriptions, but I'm going to try to like talk through it kind of briefly. So let me tell you a little story. So there's a case that I had. One particular night I was experiencing insomnia. I had a lot of agitation, was worried about stuff. It felt like it was all up in my head, and I was trying to get to sleep. And so as I'd been taught by some of my teachers, I began doing microcosmic orbit meditation, lying down, imagining drawing energy up the back, down the front of my torso. But I was intentionally, in a philosophically suspect way, reifying my agitation. I was imagining that all this agitation in my head was like some kind of fluid or something, and that when the energy of the orbit went up over the top, I could help bring it down and keep it in my lower abdomen and region of the body, and the Chinese vision of the body that's in the background here, the region of my lower dantian. And so I did this, and it carried over into my next silk reeling practice. As I recall, I actually got up and did a little bit of gentle silk reeling that night. And so after I stopped doing the silk reeling movements, it was as if I could still feel them going on in my body. Not literally, right? I wouldn't have actually mistaken the sensations of the movement still going on with actual movement of my body. But it was, at least as a first pass, as if there were a kind of echo, as it were, of the movements that continued even after the literal movement of the body stopped. It was something kinesthetic that was analogous to the auditory imagery that occurs when a song gets stuck in your head. But this time it was something more like moving circles. Now, I was not simply having mere kinesthetic memories of doing silk reeling practice. At least I would not say that they were mere memories, given my understanding of and feel for the way the word memories is used in various conversations. I perceived some of the commonality between silk reeling practice and the microcosmic orbit practice. I could grasp how they were, at some level, iterations of the same thing. And even when I was not doing either one of the practices intentionally, this like stayed around for a little while, I could feel the movement, as it were, and that felt movement was to movement what the heard sounds of a song stuck in one's mind are to sounds that one hears from outside in the case of an auditory earworm. And on top of all that, there were what I would describe as musical earworm-like urges to keep the pattern of experience going. Now, I'm going to talk more about like what it was like and try to make some more sense of it, but there are other cases of this. I don't think I'm completely unique in this. I've talked to like a practitioner who described something later that he didn't call it kinesthetic earworm, but like now I think, oh, that's what he was talking about. But here's one case. One of the Taiji teachers we saw a few minutes ago is Chen Zhonghua, and he relates the following story from a famous early 20th century Chen-style Taiji Chuan master named Chen Fa-ke. He writes this: Chen Fa-ke used to say to his disciples that when he did the Chen Taiji Chuan form, he felt that there was a little tornado inside his body. This was a sign of high-level qi activity in him. No wonder his Taiji ability became so drastically higher than the rest of the Chen-style Taiji Chuan people in his native village. Now, I don't, I'm hesitant to speak for Master Chen Fa-ke, but like using the terminology I'm using here, it seems plausible to me that like Chen Fa-ke was describing something not unlike what I'm here calling a kinesthetic earworm, or at least something very much like it. And I'd heard the story before, but I was like, oh, that seems kind of wild and kind of whack, but like this, like I feel like, oh, I can make a little more sense of it now. So, sorry, a lot of words here. But what exactly was in this particular kinesthetic earworm? So some of what was being imagined was me doing the original motions with my arms, legs, hips, other parts of the body, etc. But some of the experience that I had was not so much experience of me doing anything, and certainly not doing anything with my arms and legs, but rather simply of circular movement of some sort, somehow occurring inside my abdomen, in the area of my body, or as some of my Qigong friends would like to say, my energy body, that in Chinese is referred to as the abdominal dantian. It was like I was somehow observing an event or process that was not of my doing and did not consist in me doing anything, but rather was of some phenomenon or some set of phenomena that was or were distinct from me, that just so happened to be occurring in the space inside my own body, my lower abdomen, also up in my chest a little bit. And yet still I was feeling it occur, or if I want to be a little more philosophically precise, maybe at the very least I was having simultaneous sensations in the region of my body where it seemed like the other thing I was observing was occurring. And like, I'm allowing myself to be kind of sloppy with, like, I would be philosophically aghast at some of the stuff I'm saying here in other contexts, but I do think the distinction here between remembering a movement and imagining a similar movement and other distinctions here begin to blur here, in much the same way I think it happens in the case of musical earworms. Now, beyond the images and the memories, there were clearly dispositions to behave. At a basic level, there was a desire or urge for me to keep doing more silk reeling practice, a practice that importantly had felt like a chore to do before. I'm going to kind of skip some of this for time. Beyond that, I suppose there was also a disposition that maybe would have manifested in a physical fight, in responding to a push or a shove. I also found myself generalizing these patterns of response and thinking, like, some of them were thoughts, some of them were images of how the circular patterns might apply to non-physical sorts of conflict that can occur at work or in personal relationships. Like, if a colleague in a contentious faculty meeting comes at me, how might I receive it and send it back out in circular fashion? Or like you have a little disagreement with a lover about where to go to dinner or something. So how is any of this epistemic or cognitive? So here's one thought. I think in part, the imagined or remembered pattern of movement is like an imagined model of a situation of conflict. It describes like the sequence of changes that are likely to happen in certain kind of conflicts. And as such, it carries with it information about what kinds of force tend to follow from applications of other kinds of force and various patterns of change that are thought to be likely to recur through time. And people who do these practices, they will sometimes link it to yin-yang theory and descriptions of how change follows from change. And so insofar as that's at least workable. So question, is the knowledge in the model, or is the imagined model a tool that has to be used somehow? And I'm going to be kind of quick here, but we might want to say that the knowledge or information is contained in the model itself, such that having this conscious mental model of imagery and everything else just is knowing such and such. Or it might instead be that the model is simply a tool that one could use in order to help one come to understanding, in which case the knowing such as it is arguably more contained or manifest in the use that we put of the mental model. I think actually, like, it's another option, something kind of blurry in any given case. Whether having the model present to your experience is in itself the having of the knowledge, or is instead merely a tool that might help the model user acquire or apply knowledge. This is going to be quick, but I know both commentators want to sort of engage with this, and this going to need to frame it here briefly. I think there's also an interesting combination of knowing how and knowing that here. So the knowledge contained in or conveyed by the kinesthetic earworm might be thought of as a kind of knowing how, right? Obviously, insofar as having the circle patterned kinesthetic earworm might be the having of certain kinds of skill in fighting. Alternatively, it might be a kind of knowing that paradigmatically gets articulated, however imperfectly or poetically in words, or as above, it might be something more in between. So here's an example. This comes up a lot. I see it like in Tai Chi training. So imagine there's a Tai Chi Chuan practitioner who feels like she knows what a certain silk reeling-like technique is supposed to do when executed perfectly. And she can kind of sort of demonstrate how the technique works by making the moves and gesturing toward an imaginary practice partner. So like one way is like, oh, imagine there's somebody like right here and they're pushing my shoulder and I take it in and I sink and I spread the arms and I do the circle and the person falls over the leg. Or maybe she can demonstrate it on a completely compliant training partner, but maybe she can't like do it in practice yet. She might be able to talk in fits and starts that only another Tai Chi practitioner would be able to understand about how the technique is supposed to work in the real world, right? You can talk about it and maybe like use vocabulary from Tai Chi, like you can't toss, you can't be double heavy, you sink, but even if it's not just like the vocabulary, right? Sometimes like only somebody who's sort of got enough of the feel in the background can understand, oh, that's what those words mean. Perhaps we should say it's a knowing how that is also something that's connected to a knowing that, or perhaps vice versa, or here, like in this kind of case, we could separate it if we want, but I think it's both at the same time. So quickly, the kind of kinesthetic earworm I've described here is hard to catch. It's not as easy to catch as like Aretha Franklin's Respect, right? And it might be that you have to do this practice a long time unless you're like some kind of like Mozart-like silk reeling genius in order to even begin to get the feel of it. And I've only had a glimpse of it at best. But presumably there will be kinesthetic earworms or earworm-like phenomena that people can catch from doing many other kinds of activities. It's like athletes training for competitive sports, or dancers, yoga practitioners, people doing food preparation, like you're chopping vegetables or cake decorating. Maybe any kind of craft that involves repetitive movement of a certain sort could give rise to something like this. Like I like to think eating tortilla chips, depending on how you do it or how often, like me, you might get it. But there will be dimensions of variation that are, I think, worth exploring. So some kinesthetic earworms will be catchy, some less catchy. Maybe none of them are as catchy as auditory earworms, I don't know. Some will be epistemically rich, others, perhaps most others, I think will be epistemically impoverished. Like you might get one from doing those little spinner things that kids used to do, but my bet is that's pretty epistemically impoverished. Some will involve a rich storyline, whereas others will be relatively meaningless, like meaningless snippets of a song. Some will be connected with generalizable skills and even straightforwardly propositional knowledge, others won't. Some we might liken to mere kinesthetic memories or habits, but others might have the more complex structure and the experienced blurriness of memories and imaginings with urges to continue to remember or imagine that I've suggested is present in this circles kinesthetic earworm I've begun to explore here. There's a lot of empirical questions we might have, right? Like how common are these things? What kind of activities lead to them? What are the neural mechanisms? What features of repeated activity give rise to them? What are the mechanisms that work? I have some thoughts about that, but I don't have much to say there. I mean, not yet. But I think I have three questions I want to introduce at the end here, and then I'm going to be done. I recognize I'm pushing my time. So these are more norm-laden questions. So here's a question. What exactly is required for a set of semi-voluntary memories, imaginings, urges, behavioral manifestations, and associated thoughts to count as sufficiently song-like for it to properly be deemed an earworm or a kinesthetic earworm, rather than a mere memory or simple habit. And I suspect there's not going to be any necessary and sufficient conditions here. It's going to depend on asking how similar is this to paradigmatic cases of musical earworms. But the paradigmatic musical earworm cases, I think, are going to need to be understood in the rich way I tried to understand them above, as involving all these features. And I think just the Qigong ones that I think are really interesting are typically ones that also involve a complex backstory that we just really haven't explored here. Here's the second of these three questions. In which cases might such an earworm, an earworm of a kinesthetic but nevertheless multimodal song, be epistemically valuable for the person in whom it gets stuck? And I think that's going to depend a lot on the degree of structure of the overall earworm, how that structure connects with our interests, and what other ways knowledge related to those interests might be expressed or communicated. If it's something that's easy to communicate in words, then it's probably not going to be that important. But the ones that I think are particularly interesting are ones where it's kind of at the limits of what we can easily talk about. Here's the last thing, and I'll be done. What might the phenomena of kinesthetic earworms tell us about the value of repeated ritualized physical activity, rote memorization, and directed imagination for pedagogy in general? And here, this is just the gesture at the answer that I want to give toward the end of this book project. But I suspect it'll give us reason to value ritualized embodied action and even rote memorization as key parts of a truly effective liberal education. But